welcome to the Blue Swan. Today we are lucky to have Ben Narasin. He is a former public company CEO, existing VC, pulling unholy metrics, 13x MOIC, 97% IRR, 63 to 74% progression from seed to Series A, which is really, really good. It's almost unreal. And so on that note, please say whatever you'd like about yourself.
Yeah, look, I typically will talk about the journey to where I am today, which is, you hit on a lot of the highlights. The things that came before it were the sort of 25 years I spent as an entrepreneur before getting my company public. So long journey, lots of overnight successes in the world that take decades. And after taking that company public, one of the first .coms, I ended up taking it private as a way to get everybody liquidity. So still consider myself an entrepreneur, always feel like I live vicariously through the founders I back. I've been proud of what I've been able to achieve, but it's all on the backs of phenomenal founders. So, there is no secret or magic to it. You just have to be incredibly disciplined, work incredibly hard, and then for the most part, rely on your entrepreneurs to do great things and for the world to treat them well, because every entrepreneur needs some luck, whether that's timing, right place, right time. You have to be smart. You have to work hard, but you will need some luck along the way. And the harder you work, the luckier you'll be.
I appreciate the chance to start way back with starting fashionmail.com on Black Monday, of raising minimal capital and then taking it public and then taking it private after taking it public, which are very, very long, complex transactions. And you mentioned that you might not have been able to do those if you had raised a lot. And so I imagine there's a decent amount of red tape on what you can and can't discuss. But
I had spent all this time and energy producing these samples. I was going to my very first trade show, and having come from a business background and education anyway, and the world's just falling apart financially. And I remember thinking, why am I even bothering going to this trade show? Literally the world has just collapsed. But what I learned is hard times create great opportunities. It was after about 8 years of doing that I'd already been using the internet, but that Berners-Lee came out with www, and I believed that the web would change the world in a way I would never see again. I wanted my part of it. So I basically took all of the capital I had basically created through that business and put it all into the new business, the fashionable.com business, which started in 93. And so then went on to take that public, as you mentioned, in 99. And the navigation through that process was, going through an IPO, certainly something anybody should do once. And then the bubble bursting, and then just the torturous process of trying to find a path for all of my investors to a healthy landing during a time when literally nobody believed the internet mattered anymore. You went from the internet's going to change everything to, oh, this is obviously a huge mistake and we all need to abandon ship. So everybody wanted to buy my stake and they were willing to pay me a healthy premium, but they weren't willing to tender for the shares of the other shareholders. And I felt like that was just entirely unfair, because they could just bleed the company dry, pay 55 cents or 60 cents for a 50% stake, and then suck all the money out of it and leave my shareholders with nothing. So doing a going private transaction was the smart advice of a lawyer that I had lunch with once, wasn't even on my payroll, and it worked out exceptionally well. A lot of learnings I hope never to have to repeat. I do want to be able to help my entrepreneurs dodge the bullets that I took in the chest.
Well, there's traditional VC backed by people who are from corporate, who have founded companies, exited, IPO'd, etc. And then there are these influencer funds and celebrity funds, which are more prominent in the Los Angeles area than San Francisco. I'm curious about what you think of the allocation dynamics, like the quality of the funds.
Well, I remember when Ashton first came onto the scene, I ran into him at Y Combinator, had to be 15 plus years ago. And I remember being sort of quizzical. So I went over and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm interested in getting into some of the startup investing." And I think he's done a really good job. He's built a good team. He and his team have a good reputation for rolling up their sleeves and helping. I remember once 2 female founders, one in New York and one in LA. And one of them called me and said, "Hey, Lady Gaga wants to invest." I was like, "Okay." She said, "Actually, she wants to lead the round." And I remember saying, "Why does that help you? What is the chance Lady Gaga will have time to help you when you need help?" But I was more just surprised that this would be something an entrepreneur would consider is having somebody who has a very strong brand and celebrity as a lead in a business that wasn't obvious to me overlapped with what they were doing and that she could have impact on. Ashton is actually a great example of that, where someone has used their social media influence or otherwise to help grow a business. And maybe that's something that would be absolutely appropriate for Lady Gaga to do. But the idea of being a lead was something I was quizzical about, because that takes a very specific and rigorous set of realities that you want to do to create the right documents, because you're setting terms for everybody in the round. Because while I care a lot about being able to help, being able to make time, and I know every VC says they're there to help, the vast majority are not. There's a comment I heard once, Seagull venture capitalist. They fly over the board meeting, they crap all over everything, and then they fly away. There are more than a few people exactly like that. In fact, one of my favorite investors, Mike Maples, who I've known since actually before he moved here, used to say, Ben, my number one rule is do no harm. And I think that rule alone puts me in the top 10% of VCs. My community, venture capital and entrepreneurship, is heavily dominated by various levels of mental spiciness, as somebody once called it. To a person that lives the traditional white bread life, that mental creativity that sometimes is what creates the opportunity to succeed can be hard to ingest. They said, we help companies do a better job of hiring people with neurodiversity. And I said, what's that? And they're like, neurodiversity. Neurodivergent people think differently, act differently. You know, they might be on the autism spectrum. They might have other things. Weird is awesome. Actually, a lot of VCs transfer themselves from weird to normies. But I think the best alpha usually comes up from the people on the other side of the spectrum. Pivots happen all the time. They usually fail. There are a tiny number of pivots that have worked out exceptionally well. I think you can count them on one hand and end up with fingers left, perhaps quite a few fingers. Twitter is the one that always comes to mind. One of my partners at one of the funds I work with said something to me once that I really loved. He said, Ben, the ultimate outcome of your investment does not determine whether you made the right decision or not. You can make the wrong decision and get lucky. You can make the right decision and have it go against you and lose all your money.
Quick question about your perspective on founder secondaries and earlier rounds. At Series A and above, they're not necessarily as taboo. But I think earlier stages, aside from crowdfunding platforms, which are generally more accepting of that, I think Zenefits did a round on WeFunder at the very beginning. It raises some questions. And so I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on that.
You know, it used to be entirely off the table for anybody to take founders' liquidity, even on Series A. And then later stage, it was still frowned on, but there's been an evolution in a couple of ways. Number one, I don't think anybody ever had an issue with a life event. You as a founder just got married, had a kid, need to buy a house. You know, I think good boards are generally gracious to entrepreneurs that need to find a way to finance those sort of things. One of the things that has changed is the Series A's of today are the Series B's of yesterday. And the competitive nature of getting into some of these rounds allows the entrepreneur to pretty much write their own terms in a lot of ways. Super voting stock, Facebook style shares, founders liquidity early. A lot of that will also depend on your board member. One is, as I mentioned, life event. You want to buy a house. Keep in mind that when I took my company public, I asked my underwriter on the IPO if I could sell $1 million worth of shares to be able to get an apartment in New York City. And their answer was no. It sends the wrong message. So, you know, it's hard for me to have an enormous amount of sympathy, but I didn't like when it was done to me that way, so I don't want it to do it to somebody else. The other reason is that a founder has the opportunity to exit the whole thing, and you'd like them to stay focused on the big thing. So giving a founder enough now so they can truly shoot for the moon or Mars, you know, I've seen that work. Maybe a company has an opportunity to be bought for $300 million and the founder still owns 30%. Well, it's a big decision to say no to that. Maybe in saying no to that, the board could proactively agree that they might be able to take 10, 20, $30 million off the table now. There's a saying in poker, the money you lose is the money you didn't win because you didn't bet. So every bet you didn't make when you end up winning that pot is money you didn't take off the table. Entirely understanding the reality of hedge betting. I sold some of my better companies because when I started my fund, I committed to doing a 10% GP commit 3 funds in a row. And at the time, if it weren't for cashless carry, that would have been over 100% of my liquid net worth. By using what's called cashless carry, which is where I choose not to take fees in exchange for having those fees go towards my stake in the fund, I got it down to over 50%. But I really wanted it to be at or below 50% of my liquid net worth as a way to feel like I was doing the right thing for my family, to be able to look my wife in the eye and say I'm behaving logically. But I'm older now, I have kids, you want to have some balance in your life. So I took liquidity. I took liquidity in things that have gone on to be worth far more. And I knew they would be, or believed strongly that they would be, but it was something I needed to do for lifestyle reasons and to feel secure. And I think that's reasonable for an entrepreneur as well. I often tell entrepreneurs the story of my IPO to make this point, to make the point of how valuable even an extra day can be, an extra hour. So I signed the underwriter's letter and we had our first drafting session on Friday. For those of you that don't know, IPO drafting sessions is where you bring your lawyers, your underwriter's lawyers into a room and you start drawing up the documents that are eventually going to go out to the investors in the S1 or whatever document you are using. We work all day. It's Friday. Day ends. Lead lawyer from the underwriters team says, okay, this has been a really useful session. Let's get back together first thing Monday and get back to work. And I said, whoa. Hold on a second, guys. We're not getting back together on Monday. We're getting back together tomorrow. Okay. If you have kids and you're married, feel free to have breakfast with your families. And then we'll be right back here and we'll work through the weekend and we will work through every single day until I have a public company, because I know people who've had their offering shelved and I don't believe we're going to get there. So I'm not going to be the reason we don't. So the IPO process for me was about 3 months long. During that 3 months, we took off one Sunday. A decade went by before anything else came out. And what came out was Lending Club, by the way, biggest tech IPO of the decade. So imagine that I had decided instead of just taking off one Sunday, I'll take the whole weekend. Well, now we wouldn't have been able to price on Thursday, would we? We would have priced on Friday, except we wouldn't price on Friday because the underwriter would have said, ooh, Ben, it's a bloodbath out there. We better wait. Let's let the weekend pass. I'm sure things will be fine on Monday. Monday comes, more blood. Tuesday, blood. Wednesday, blood. And I'd end up owing a few $1 million to lawyers and accountants and printing companies. But for my drive to insist we worked every day but one in a 3-month period, I do not believe I would have had a public company. I believe I would have had a big pile of debt. So sometimes that day matters. It makes all the difference. Just like sometimes one person on your board or in your investor syndicate can be all the difference. It's rare, but it happens. And when it does, sometimes it's the difference between life and death for a company. One of the nice things about being a solo GP is you only have yourself to answer to, for the most part. Truth is the ultimate defense. Look, I don't think people should work hard just to work hard. You work hard because there's things to get done. You can figure out what justifies your time. The most valuable word an entrepreneur has is no, deciding what not to do and obliterating anything that takes away from it.
Starting a company is a lot like giving birth to a child, in the sense that if people understood, how difficult and painful it was, they might not go through with it. At the same time, like virtually every sane parent loves their children, and a lot of entrepreneurs love their company. There is this medical study I saw a while back that showed that when entrepreneurs looked at their company, their brains reacted in the same way as when they looked at their children, and then when they looked at competitors' companies, their brains acted, and it's like someone's attacking their child. And so on that note, like when is it time to conceive? When is it time to wait? And then when is it time to unfortunately maybe let a company go in the lifestyle?
I have been investing now, as we've talked about, for 18 years. I probably funded over 150 companies. Once ever have I said to an entrepreneur, I think it's time to let go. Look, I think I said this once. I want everybody to run through walls, but if you're banging on a brick wall that turns out to be 18 bricks thick and brain matter's coming out of your nose, then hey, I get it. There's some things that just cannot be conquered. But my question is, why do you keep banging on that wall? Why aren't you trying to go around that wall or over that wall or get out a pickaxe and chisel your way through that wall? Creativity goes a really long way in solving problems and there's so many examples of this where entrepreneurs hit an absolute wall but come up with something else. And yes, this is a form of pivot. I mean, there's stories. NVIDIA, one of, if not the most valuable company in the world, depending on any given day, they were at a point where they had no cash. They had to go to their clients and say, if you don't prepay these orders, we will not be able to deliver them because we will be out of business. It's a long, hard road, and you never know how long, and you never know how hard. You will underestimate how long and how hard every single time. That's startup land. It will take longer than you think, and it will be harder than you think. But in the end, the rewards can be totally outrageously phenomenal or zero. It is a irreplaceable and priceless education to build a business. And I think many companies, particularly in the technology space, understand and recognize that. I think that, there's a saying, man plans and God laughs. I think that would be a great idea if it was achievable. You mentioned earlier the conversation about startups being like a child. You don't know when you have a child whether they're going to grow up to be a basketball player, a violinist, a golfer, a business person, an accountant, a doctor, a lawyer. You don't have the ability to control where your company can become, what it can become, where it can go. You can steer it. You need a northern light. You have a place you want it to go. But how big and powerful and wonderful it becomes, or how not, that isn't something you can dial in. And so I think you pursue, first of all, think about being an entrepreneur, right? So there's different ways people approach being an entrepreneur. I remember when I was at Babson, I was talking to another young person there, and I was like, what brought you to Babson? Why did you come here? I said, well, I want to learn to be an entrepreneur. And this is in college. I remember thinking, yeah, I don't think that's how it works, pal. I don't think you become an entrepreneur. I think you're either born an entrepreneur or you're not. So I was not born with the gifts that would be needed to be a basketball player. And not everybody was born with the gifts that are needed to be an entrepreneur. The tenacity, the drive, the intelligence, the just unbeatability. By the way, very similar to some of the things that you need to be a great athlete, a great anything. To be a great anything takes an enormous amount. But I think there's a fundamental difference in what it takes to be an entrepreneur than being many other types of things. Like I remember Halsey Minor once said he was raising crazy amounts of money. He'd raise $100 million and he'd immediately go out to raise another 100. And I was asking, like, why? How can you do that? Inconceivable to me, inconceivable. And he made a comment. He said, look, I can hit a wall at 80 miles an hour or 800 miles an hour. I'm dead either way. But if I make it a lot bigger at 800 miles an hour. Paraphrasing, of course. Like it takes a certain level of risk tolerance. I remember I would get to know all these young VCs in my journey to try to understand venture and older VCs, and every VC I could meet. I've met over 300 VCs. I really, really grilled them. And later, after I got to know all the senior VCs, I'd try to meet the younger VCs, and I'd try to take them out as soon as they got the job. And then I'd try to take them out again a year later, see what they learned. I remember asking one, like, what was your big learning this year working for famous firm X? And he said, well, I realized I need to be more comfortable with risk. I was like, what do you mean? And he said, I need to realize that in my investments, I could lose money. I was like, what the hell took you 364 extra days to learn that? That's your entire job, dude. Now, in fairness, a lot of young people going into venture came out of banking. And so there's a fundamental difference there that unfortunately is really painful and not helping venture in a lot of ways. But it was like, wow. You learned that water was wet? It took you a year to learn that. Huh, amazing. So there's a risk tolerance. There's actually, I don't know if it's an enjoyment of risk, but it's just a comfort that you could end up with absolutely nothing and fail to absolute zero if this doesn't work. That's a unique personality trait that I do not believe is born into a whole lot of people. The next part is, how do you figure out what you're going to do? Well, Parker Conrad is actually the only person I know, and he's done a phenomenal job, who sort of researched his way into a business opportunity. Back then, if my memory serves, Obamacare was about to hit. He believed that was going to be an enormous thing. But anyway, he wanted to figure out where he could be to make a business out of this amazing change in life that was going to happen with Obamacare. And that's how he found his way to what became Zenefits. To be an entrepreneur, you need something that absolutely grabs you by the throat and will not let go. Something that has to be done. There's an old saying that mercenaries do less well than missionaries. Now, you need mercenaries in your company. That's called a sales organization. But net, a missionary-like zeal to changing the world in some way, to achieving something that you believe must be achieved. That's what you need as an entrepreneur to go on to the best and biggest possible outcomes, because you are driven by more than just the financial nature of the opportunity. And I think those two things combined, the right human with the right idea that must be done, those are as rare can be. If you are in Europe, it's not uncommon to use a banker. And I remember I came across a deal that I was interested in, I wanted to spend time with. I said they weren't quite ready to raise yet. I said I wanted to see them when they were. So I'd actually like to see them a little bit before they were. They said, we need to bring on a banker. I said, oh, yeah, that's a terrible idea. You bring on a banker, the deal's dead. I think all of us benefit from a level of introspection and self-understanding, which is hard. You know, I'm a solo GP. People often ask, where's your team? Well, I say it's right here. Me, myself, and I. And I will argue with myself out loud. But net, you know, I want to try to pick apart my own weaknesses of where I might have missed something here or why I might be overvaluing something there. I know I'm a quirky guy, but I'm pretty familiar with most of those quirks, and the ones I might not have known about, my wife will emphasize and point out and try to help me realize are there. But the more you can think about how you will live life under pressure, you will be in a situation where it's all on your shoulders. So be prepared to understand that unless you're going to want to run a one-person shop, that pressure increases dramatically. You better, at a minimum, be absolutely fine with pressure. At a max, maybe you enjoy it. Because if you do, you'll probably do just fine. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Anytime. Thank you for doing this.
Take care.